Sugar makes you hungry, carbohydrates make you fat, polyunsaturated oils make you inflamed and sick. I mean, I came out with it. We've got to try and make our message simple. And that was my simple message. Who would have thought that this concept would get me into as much trouble as I'm in? It's just a theory that can never be proven, because we're never going to be able to do a double-blind crossover study for a lifetime to prove this. With one simple personal choice, with stopping eating processed food, that you could change everything. Just the term nutrition creates so much emotion, so much fighting. It comes down to egos, industry and money. Now, eating real food, which is what I believe low carb healthy fat is, has helped my health, and real food is low carbohydrate healthy fat. So the talk today is about inflammation, and I think inflammation is the cause of most modern disease. But how do I link that to nutrition? Well, that's my crime, okay? And I'm guilty of that. Look, we're getting fatter and sicker, that's the problem. How did we get here? How did we get fatter and sicker? Now, I want to look at medical science and nutritional science. Now, medical science is based on the scientific method, which is observation, hypothesis and test it. Nutritional science has had about 100 years of being around, and it's based on making food tastier, improving shelf life and profitability. Unfortunately, in medicine, as a profession, we've believed that nutrition science was the same as medical science, but it's not. Something has to change. We can't wait for governments to change policy because they're influenced by lobbyists. We can't wait for industry to change and corporations to change because they're driven by profit. We can't wait for the health professionals to change because they're all following guidelines, and many of you have spoken out about the fact that there's a fear of coming out and talking about this because the guidelines have been written by the food and the pharmaceutical industry. So briefly, why am I here? Look, my early years I was raised on sugar, refined carbohydrate and polyunsaturated oils, and I was a fat kid. I've dropped 23 kilos, but I used to be a toffee. 2000 was a bit of a turning point for me. I had a big pituitary tumour. I had surgery, chemotherapy, radiotherapy. Had another lot of surgery a few years ago. So I've had a brain tumour, don't trust anything I say. I've had brain surgery, so I'm not responsible for anything I say. As an orthopaedic surgeon, my patients are getting heavier, their knees are failing, joints are failing. I look after most of the diabetes complications in northern Tasmania. I put up a really mild picture here because it only gets uglier. Most weeks I'm now amputating something off someone in the public system. The whole system is now failing under the burden of lifestyle-related disease. And most people on the planet are eating by the food pyramid. And as a result of that, you're going to die by the food pyramid, and along the way, you're going to look like the food pyramid. I'm not the first orthopaedic surgeon to dabble in the field of endocrinology. As a Canadian orthopaedic surgeon, managed to win a Nobel Prize for the discovery of insulin. But along the way, I've come to realise that inflammation sits behind every condition. Now, whether or not it's diabetes, cancer, autoimmune disease, cardiovascular disease, it's been a common theme talked about. If we could find the cause of inflammation and reverse it, then that becomes a model to prevent virtually all modern disease. So if we can find that toxic material, we might be on the way. I've developed what I call the model, the nutritional model of inflammation, which I believe is a combination of sugar, particularly fructose, refined carbohydrate, polyunsaturated oils, and I think it's toxic. So if that inflammation is true, then that not only becomes inflammatory for the whole body, but it becomes a model of modern disease. So let's work through that model. We're going to think about the observation, hypothesis and mechanism, some pathophysiology. I guarantee it won't be as scientific as the last couple of days. So here's some observations. Look, we got to the top of the food chain over 2.5 million years. I think we've been on a fad diet for the last 50 to 60 years, particularly the last 30, but yet we're getting fatter and sicker. Obesity is increasing, cancer is increasing, arthritis and gout are increasing. There's been a doubling of gout in the last 10 years. Autoimmune disease is increasing, mental health issues, with a spectrum from autism right through to depression and dementia. Everything's increasing. I don't know of many conditions which are decreasing. So welcome to modern disease. Medicine, unfortunately, focuses on the disease rather than the cause. You know, we spend most of our days servicing the vehicle rather than putting the right fuel in. There are spiralling health costs, and we're trying to medicate our way out of it, and it's failing. It's all completely financially unsustainable. So look, we're doomed. We're lemmings about to go over the edge of the cliff, and unless we get back to prevention. Most of you here have put on a parachute as you get on over the edge of the cliff. So that's my observations. Here's my hypothesis. The inflammation sits behind every condition. Let's find the toxic material. I believe the combination of sugar, fructose, particularly refined carbohydrates and polyunsaturated oils, create inflammation that renders the body susceptible to damage. So other factors play a role, and we go through that list: stress, cortisol, genetics, chemicals, the bowel organisms. We touched on it with the gut biotome. It's a huge area. Exercise plays a role. We heard about latitude, longitude. As your latitude changes, a whole lot of diseases come along, and the same thing with longitude, and particularly across the South Pacific, diabetes increases, sleep, vitamin D, even artificial lighting. So that's the hypothesis. What's the mechanism? We've heard sugar, it's half fructose, half glucose. The metabolism of fructose was really only described in 2010, and we're still learning about it. So all of the textbooks do not have it in it. All this is brand new, and therefore I think it makes all guidelines completely redundant. So what are the natural sources of fructose? Well, you've got seasonal fruits, sugar, where it's half sucrose, honey, which is a little bit higher in fructose than glucose, and that's why honey is a bit sweeter than normal table sugar. This is what I call manufactured fruit. Virtually all fruit that we find at the market, it's been modified in some form, it's been treated in some form. And then you've got high fructose corn syrup. Carbohydrate, okay, well that's really what the other thing is. And carbohydrate is just glucose or repeating chains of glucose. It doesn't matter if it's bread, rice, pasta, maltose, lactose, dextrose, ultimately it tends to be glucose. There's only other carbohydrate that's around, this thing called fructose. And we've heard about glucose metabolism. This is the orthopaedic surgical opinion about it, right? You know, glucose is absorbed from the gut, goes straight to the brain, muscle under the influence of insulin. And if we take in too much of it, it gets stored as fat, again under the influence of insulin. About 4 grams of glucose in the bloodstream at any point in time, about 1 teaspoon. So if we ingest more than 1 teaspoon, we metabolise that to fat. So one slice of bread's got about 5 teaspoons of glucose. Bowl of pasta, standard around 16 to 20, same thing with a bowl of rice. Healthy fats, butter, cheese, nuts, Mediterranean oils, and pasture-fed or natural animal meats. Let's define polyunsaturated oils, whether or not it's talking about vegetable oils. Seen any oil come out of a vegetable? It doesn't exist, does it? I mean, it's marketing. And margarine, I mean, they colour margarine to look like butter. I mean, there's nothing natural about it. The difference between a fat and an oil is determined by its state at room temperature. So a fat is solid at room temperature, and oil is liquid at room temperature. Animal fats tend to be liquid at body temperature, but solid at room temperature. And seed and plant oils are flexible even out in very cold climates because nutrients can get up and down the plant. And the difference becomes the double bonds within it. So each double bond is a point of flexibility and makes it more liquid at low temperature. That flexibility, those double bonds, which you've got in polyunsaturated, many, are points, however, unfortunately, of weakness. They're points of potential oxidation, and when oxidation occurs, it's like rust and you have oxygen-free radical release. So at every double bond, if they become oxidised, it can become quite inflammatory. If we're looking for a mechanism of inflammation, let's think about that combination. So a little bit about pathophysiology, and again, we're going to go through some biochemistry. Fructose metabolism, again, very complex. Robert Lustig put this into a diagrammatic form in about 2010, so I've stolen it from him with his permission. And we're going to look at this. Forget all the pathways there. I'm going to simplify it down. So if we put sugar in, we put fructose in to that liver cell, that hepatocyte, a whole lot of things are going to occur. A very small amount's going to go towards glycogen because most fructose comes with glucose, and glycogen stores are going to be improved. There's an aldehyde pathway in the liver, and we know that because if you get fruit, you make wine from it. Right? And guess what? The liver does exactly the same. So if you put too much fructose in, you actually create an alcohol pathway. And the liver does the fermenting, and too much of that is a contributing factor to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Fructose is actually converted into uric acid. Again, let's just skip the pathways and look at it. That occurs up in this corner of the hepatocyte. What does that uric acid do? It actually affects nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is critical to multiple things within the body. And there are three forms of it. There's a neuronal form, which is involved in supplying blood to the brain and maintaining that. There's an endothelial form, which keeps the tone in our blood vessels and keeping our blood pressure under control. And there's also an inducible form, which is involved in controlling how our white cells move around the body, how our immune function occurs. So if you lose the vasodilatory effect of nitric oxide, if you inhibit it with uric acid, then you start affecting the blood flow to your brain, start affecting your blood flow, and you create hypertension. And it possibly has an effect on our immunity. It, in fact, can slow up how our white cells actually get around to do their job. And particularly something like diabetes, which has got very poor healing, I think this is a major contributing factor. Now I'm going to throw insulin resistance on one slide, okay? Too much fructose is involved in the whole process of insulin resistance. It's also a leptin inhibitor. So if you have too much fructose, it inhibits leptin. Leptin's job is to tell you you've actually had enough to eat. So if you actually inhibit that effect, then you start getting hungry. It also stimulates ghrelin, and ghrelin is that hormone which makes your tummy rumble. So we've got here sugar, fructose, is actually inhibiting our satiety. It's making us hungry. This is the pathway I want to dwell upon with presentation. If you have too much fructose, it's involved in small dense LDL production as the end product. Now I understand it goes to predominantly VLDL and then it's converted ultimately to small dense LDL. But for the purposes of the talk, if you have fructose and it gets ingested, de novo lipogenesis, the bad end product is small dense LDL. If we have too much sugar, too much fructose come in, we produce a lot more LDL particles. Those lipoproteins are filled up with a combination of fat, protein, phosphate, cholesterol. What fat is within those lipoproteins is interesting. And what fat is in them is reflected in what we eat. It's either a saturated fat or it's a polyunsaturated fat. So our traditional diet means that, which is relatively high in saturated fats or monounsaturated fats with one bond, means that there's very little double bonds within the fat within those lipoproteins. And that's, I believe, and so it's got no double bonds, there's nothing to oxidise, it's not inflammatory, it's as inflammatory as a brick wall. However, if you then fill up the fat within our fat with a polyunsaturated oils, we create all these double bonds, highly inflammatory, become oxidised, like dry kindling, it releases lots of lots of oxygen-free radicals, and I think that's highly inflammatory. Where do those lipoproteins, those small dense LDLs, end up? And they end up in the blood vessel wall. Complex slide, but at the top you've got the blood inside the blood vessel. Then you've got a layer of the blood vessel wall, and then you've got what's called the subintimal layer. Now I call that small dense LDL, the troublesome one, the Goldilocks particle. It's just the right size to get into the blood vessel wall and not get out. The HDLs, the good ones, the mopping up ones, they zip in and out and they do the clearing. The big fluffy ones just float on by, but the small dense LDLs get trapped in that layer. If they get oxidised in the subintimal layer, then you've got a whole lot of double bonds, a whole lot of inflammation. You've then got foam cells that come along, macrophages, foam cells that clear that out, all at the subintimal layer. There's a critical step there. Those foam cells, which are involved in the clearance, are under the direct effect of vitamin D. This was a real clincher for me, so that when we have in nature a high dose of fructose, which is summer, the body has this fabulous mechanism in place to clear away the inflammation. It's called vitamin D. Whereas in winter, if we're all eating a whole lot of sugar, we're creating this inflammatory load in the subintimal layer of our blood vessels, yet we're not having any vitamin D. I think that's where vitamin D comes into the equation with fructose metabolism. Now guess what? Our cell membrane walls are full of fat. We've got a choice of filling up our cell membrane walls with either a saturated fat or a polyunsaturated fat. The same thing happens with our mitochondrial membrane walls, and we've been hearing about mitochondrial metabolism. And again, that wall of it can either be filled up with a saturated fat or a polyunsaturated fat. But what happens if our small dense LDLs and our membranes of our cells and our mitochondria are now filled up with a polyunsaturated oil? Is that a whole lot of oxidation, a whole lot of inflammation, a whole lot of oxygen-free radical? Well, I think it is. So unfortunately, I now think our arterial walls in every organ right through our body are filled up with an inflammatory material. Our cell membranes are now highly inflamed, and so are our mitochondrial membranes. Carbohydrate is predominantly glucose and the fructose component can be turned into LDLs. There's a pathway called the polyol pathway. The polyol pathway means that about 3% of carbohydrate gets converted into fructose, polyol conversion. Along the way in that process, there are some oxygen-free radical release, so about 3%. This article, 1984. If you are insulin resistant, hyperglycemic with a blood glucose of above about 8, and that's not that high, there is not a 3% transposition of glucose to fructose. There's 10 times that, 30%. That means if we have our standard carbohydrate intake, we're not converting 3% of glucose to fructose, we're converting 30% of it. That means all of a sudden that normal carbohydrate diet, which most people are having in society, we're converting 30% out to fructose. That means a massive increase in our LDL production, a massive increase in our oxygen-free radical release. And again, that's occurring in every blood vessel, in every single organ of the body. I think that accounts for our runaway train of inflammation and modern disease as a mechanism. Have we got any association evidence? Okay, well, again, this is impossible to prove. If we look at that sugar consumption, carbohydrate and polyunsaturated oils, in the 1970s we had a significant increase in our sugar intake. I think that means that we had a higher increase in the amount of LDL production in our blood vessels. We also did the same thing in the 1970s. We started increasing our carbohydrate intake dramatically. So that means we've got even more LDL production. We're starting to flood the system with LDL, small dense LDL particles. What do we do with our polyunsaturated oils? Well, guess what? The purple line is there. Andreas has shown us that the butter intake's coming up again in Sweden. Maybe we'll need to move there. But our polyunsaturated oil increased dramatically. Kentucky Fried Chicken went from cooking in lard to cooking in a seed oil, all in that time frame. All of that's been associated with an increase in, I believe, therefore, oxidation, more rust, not only in our blood vessels but in our cell membranes. Have we got any proof of that? Well, Stefan Goyanet put this together a few years ago, and I've contacted him and I've tried to work out why would he collect this data, and he didn't collect it, he just put it together. And what it's looking at is the linoleic acid levels within body fat. So back in the 1960s, they started measuring linoleic acid. Linoleic acid is an omega-6 fatty acid. It is the inflammatory acid, or the inflammatory fat, and started measuring the amount of it within the body fat. And I've asked him, I said, why did they start doing it? Nobody really knows, but they did a whole lot of measurements in the 1960s and they've continued on multiple studies. So in 1960, about 8% of our body fat was inflammatory fat. 2010, about 25%. We've had a threefold increase of the amount of fat within our body which is inflammatory, as distinct from before. The same thing's happened in women's breast milk, particularly in the westernised society, and that's including French as well as US data there. Whereas African women's breast milk remains low in it. And the omega-3 component, the alpha-linoleic acid, is staying around about the same proportion throughout that same time frame. So the amount of omega-6 to omega-3 ratios have changed. And this is what we're feeding our babies. This is the building blocks that our children are then using to create their bodies. That equals further inflammation right throughout the body, more oxygen-free radical release. I think that's highly toxic, and I think it becomes a potential model of modern disease. So that's the association evidence. It's pretty average, but it's there. Have we got any intervention evidence? Well, we've been hearing for the last couple of days about low-carb, healthy fat diets. And there are multiple studies supporting the fact that it's a more effective method of management of obesity and diabetes. Ketogenic diets are clearly being used in epilepsy, diabetes and cancer management. And there are good results, albeit early. Let's look at some longevity cultures. Some of you will have heard of blue zones. And to try and work out what is the common thing between those cultures. And a lot of that's actually looked at. But the trouble is it's not what they eat, it's what they don't eat that's given them longevity. And what they're not eating is processed food. They also have a great commitment to spirit and community, which I think is part of the whole thing as well. They're low stress environments. So look, that's a bit of intervention evidence. And again, it's not good evidence. And I'm really looking forward to seeing further evidence that comes out over the next 10, 20 years. Where does this leave us? Well, I think that the combination of sugar, refined carbohydrate and polyunsaturated oils is toxic. I think it's inflammatory. And I want to add to Ivor Cummins' talk yesterday, where he talked about 3 kicks to the system, of insulin resistance and the hyperinsulinemia. It's happening at the liver, it's happening at the pancreas, it's happening at fat, it's then happening peripherally. But I think the kicker is the final one, is polyunsaturated oils, which hasn't really been talked about in creating that modern disease. We've got good models now. We're talking about obesity, diabetes. That's my theory about further link. Ted Naiman touched on it yesterday, but I do think that modern food is a weapon of mass destruction. I think inflammation sits behind every condition. If we look hard at processed food, this becomes a concept, a model of what may in fact be toxic and accounting for modern disease. I think it's time to put out the inflammation. What does that involve? Well, I think it means eating local, seasonal, natural. Being mindful of where that food's come from. That's a huge term about being mindful, but being aware of the whole food journey. And that's what we're all on about. We're all chasing that real food. And I think if we get in tune with that, then we can start, here we're debating how many grams I have of this or that, or what's the percentage. And I think we're making it too hard. We start thinking about our food in that more holistic overall aspect, then it sorts itself out. What's real food? Well, that's the future of eating. It tends to end up being low in carbohydrate, low in sugar. It has a higher amount of healthy fats. It's a normal amount of protein. Notice I don't talk about any specific grams there, because you tend to, once you actually start eating real food again, you become in tune with what you require. Andreas mentioned it. Eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full. I have days when I need fat today, I need protein, I need green leafy vegetables. I no longer have a day where I need sugar. Now that's a huge turnaround for the cake judge at the hospital, okay? Honest. I wouldn't take plasters off children unless they brought me a chocolate cake. Right? I am now trying to redeem my sins. Minimise your polyunsaturated oils. So look, here it is. I think we can choose health. I think we can choose it if you want it, our health. Sugar, I think, makes us hungry. Carbohydrates, particularly refined in excess, make you fat. Polyunsaturated oils are tied clearly up with inflammation and sickness. We can't wait for governments to change. We can't wait for the corporations to change. We cannot wait for the health profession to change. And I'm a health professional. That leaves just two people, me and you. That's it. And together, the two of us can make a difference. But don't listen to me, because I'm not allowed to talk about it. But you can listen to my wife, Belinda, right? So have a listen to her. I believe in social media and the grassroots revolution, and it needs to be led in that forum. And you're all part of that, and it's an honour to be amongst you all. Whether or not that means honour amongst thieves, I'm not certain. But thank you all for being part of our journey.